Okay, so it's Our Lady of Suburbia Catholic community, right? You go there and you find out what's going on, okay? Don't attract attention to yourself. Your favorite hymn is All Are Welcome. You think it's healthy to question dogma, and your sister's an Episcopalian priest. Got it? If anyone starts asking questions, just mutter something about ecumenism and dialogue and bluff your way through it, okay? Find out if they're holding hands during the Lord's Prayer, if the priest is insisting people call him Jerry rather than Father, and if they're still clapping when the band plays Amazing Grace. Got it? All right, good luck. Hey, these files don't fill themselves. He's a good guy, solid, reliable. Doesn't have much to say, but that ain't always a bad thing, especially when it comes to the liturgy. And that reminds me of a case. I call it the case of the quiet men. Silence and the Catholic Church go back a long way. Remember St. Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons asking, "What does this silence betoken?" St. Thomas's intention there, a desire to not put your foot in it by saying more than you should, is a lot like the quote attributed to Mark Twain. Better to keep silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. A lot of people think Twain never actually said that. Then again, Twain's a lot like Yogi Berra in that way. He never said half the things he said. The book of Proverbs says much the same thing as Twain probably didn't. Even a fool is thought wise if he keeps silent, and discerning if he holds his tongue. Silence is held in high regard in the scriptures. St. Luke, the physician, the author of the most historical of the Gospels, a man who must have got people to talk about what happened, writes about Our Lady the Silent Contemplative. Mary took all of these things and pondered them in her heart. St. Mark's Gospel emphasizes the reverent silence that comes from holy fear. The secular world, on the other hand, doesn't seem to value silence. At best, it's seen as empty, waiting time. At worst, we scramble to fill it. If we're lucky, we fill it with music or conversation. If we're unlucky, we fill it with noise and distraction. Either way, we seem to have little time for silence and peace in our lives. What does that have to do with the liturgy? Surely the Mass can't be purely silent? Let's pull out that old warhorse, Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Vatican II document on the liturgy. It calls for exterior activities such as acclamations, responses, psalms, antiphons, hymns, as well as actions, gestures, and bodily postures. And that makes all kinds of sense. The faithful are called to be active participants in the liturgy, and while that participation isn't about jumping and running and clapping and dancing like some hyperactive squirrel, it certainly involves responding physically and vocally. We are physical creatures. This is something Protestantism and its supporters within the Church seem to forget with their desacramentalization and emphasis on feelings. We have bodies and voices. We use our tongues and our hands and other body parts to sin. It's only right we should use them to worship the God who saves us from sin. After all, it was his hands that Christ spread wide. It was his blood he shed for us. It was his body that was broken on the altar of the cross, and his voice he used to preach to us and pass the deposit of faith on to the apostles. Christ created the church in his own body, coming from his wounded side on the cross like Eve from Adam's rib. He created her to be his bride, his mystical body, sustained with his body and blood. He brims over with so much love he didn't want to be alone, and so he created her. Of course he wants to hear her responses. I mean, let's face it. If the church taught the bride of Christ should do nothing more than sit down and shut up, all those people who call us misogynistic would be right. Oh, so right. But we don't. So we aren't. So they're wrong. But silence has its place, and the Church has always recognized this. Now, I don't need to go back to some ancient document either. I just need to read a little further onwards in good old Sacrosanctum Concilium. Acclamations, responses, psalms, hymns, actions, gestures, and bodily postures, as well as sacred silence at the proper times. Obviously, silence has value. There's something really awesome happening on the altar at Mass. Really, there's something awesome happening in the whole church during Mass. The people of God are gathered together with God, all of them, in the flesh, not some metaphorical spiritual representation, but an actual physical representation. There's no way that you can appreciate that, wrap your head around it, if you're jibber-jabbering all the time. Silence, either yourself shutting up so you can think, or people around you, not to mention the choir and the orchestra and organ, shutting up so you can hear yourself think. That's vital in order to fully immerse yourself in the sacred mysteries. And of course, that leads to a practical suggestion, a change that can be immediately and easily, if not without resistance, put into parishes. Ditch the communion hymn. Shut up while people are receiving. Let people digest, literally, what just happened in quiet solitude and silence, rather than filling the air with the sound of crashing guitars and off-key singing. That starts to border on a different case. Let's close this one first. You might think that we, the laity, the congregation, should keep silent, but the priest certainly shouldn't. After all, he's offering the Mass, right? We've got to hear what he has to say. Well, yes and no. See, the Mass is a conversation between the priest, acting on our behalf, and God. He is offering a sacrifice to God for us. He can do that because he is a priest. He's not like us. He's not a layman. He's ordained, consecrated, special, and separate. Everything in the Mass points to this: his place in the sanctuary, his dress, his actions. We don't need to hear the conversation between God and the priest. Even though it's about us, for us, it doesn't concern us. Like a lawyer going into a judge's chambers to speak about a case, the plaintiff doesn't need to be there or hear what is said. We cannot understand the law to the degree a lawyer does, and we cannot offer a sacrifice like the priest does. So we hand things over to the professionals who will do a better job than we ever could. And before you get all het up and demand to represent yourself, remember, that way lies Protestantism. You might be able to argue your way out of a parking ticket without calling in some slick, fast-talk merchant with tassels on his shoes, but you certainly can't confect the Eucharist. And without eating and drinking the body and blood of Christ, ain't none of us getting to heaven. So you will notice, or at least I hope you notice, that the heart of the Mass is said silently. Now, silently doesn't actually mean the priest doesn't make a noise. He moves his lips, but he speaks very, very softly. So softly, it's unlikely the altar servers can hear him. Certainly, the congregation can't. This portion of the Mass is called the canon of the Mass. Today, we know it as Eucharistic Prayer number 1. It was the only Eucharistic prayer until the new Missal of 1970. It starts with the Sanctus, the chanting of Holy, 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 and it ends... Well, there's actually some debate about when it ends. The canon was in use from 1570. All editions of the Mass prior to 1962 seem to indicate the canon went on until the end of the Mass. The Missal of 1962, the Missal used today in the Tridentine Rite, indicates the canon ends before the Our Father prayer. But regardless of these details, which are a fascinating distraction, of course, the purpose of the canon is very clear. It's the heart of the Mass. It contains the words of consecration, the very words that indicate the transubstantiation of bread and wine into the salvific body and blood of Christ. And this, more than any other reason, is why the priest is silent and unheard here. Yes, the Mass is a conversation between God and the priest, and so we don't need to hear it. But that doesn't mean we can't. It's private but not secret. A priest can speak the rest of the Mass quietly, but he doesn't have to. But the canon is always silent, broken only by the sound of a bell to signify the moment of consecration. Why is that? Think about what is happening on the altar. During the canon, the Eucharist is confected, transubstantiation happens, Jesus Christ is on that altar, and the altar is Calvary. Not a symbol of Calvary, but Calvary itself represented. The priest's words don't inform us or symbolize what is happening. They are a literal avowal to God where he is offering the same sacrifice of Calvary. The priest's silence is the silence of Calvary, the silence around the cross broken only by the last words of Christ. It is the silence of the high priest going into the Holy of Holies. Everyone there, from priest to laity, is united in the same silent prayer as God is sacrificed for our sins. Pope Benedict XVI, writing when he was merely Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, says in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, The silent prayers of the priest invite him to make his task truly personal, so that he may give his whole self to the Lord. They highlight the way in which all of us, each one personally yet together with everyone else, have to approach the Lord. The number of these priestly prayers has been greatly reduced in the liturgical reform, but, thank God, they do exist. Yes. See, I've been talking about the canon of the Mass and said we now know it as the Eucharistic prayer number 1 in the new Missal of 1970. It's the same prayer, but it's not said silently, or at least it doesn't have to be. Many priests do, in fact, say the Eucharistic prayer silently, that is, very quietly, keeping it between them and God. Elsewhere in the Novus Ordo, the number of silent prayers has been reduced, but, thank God, as Benedict says, they do still exist. This is the liturgical reform, something that happened after Vatican II and was informed more by the spirit of Vatican II and less by the actual documents of Vatican II. Really, the spirit of Vatican II is like the ghost in those old Scooby-Doo cartoons. He's causing a lot of ruckus, but when you catch him and pull the mask off, you find out it was old man Protestantism all along. None of this, of course, is supposed to say the Novus Ordo is bad or that it isn't valid. You would have to be straight out anti-Catholic to say the Novus Ordo is to be avoided, or that it's an offense against God, or that it's a danger to souls. It's absolutely valid, absolutely confects the Eucharist, absolutely imparts grace. It is certainly good enough. But good enough ain't best, and specifically in this regard, in the matter of silent prayers offered by the priest, it certainly isn't. The silence of the priest isn't a private obfuscation, a shutting out of the laity from the Mass. It highlights the distinctiveness of the priest, showing how he, silently petitioning God on our behalf, is different from us and special. This disavowal of the uniqueness of the priest, of trying to blur the lines between the laity and priesthood, of trying to make the laity into little priests with their ministries and participation, this is a distortion of the true message of the Second Vatican Council. The Council called the laity to personal holiness. Really, this was the first call of this nature directed explicitly at the laity, although, of course, personal holiness had been the goal since the time of Christ, or even before. But the Council called for a sanctification of our daily tasks, of finding holiness in uniting our work with Christ so it became not our work, but the work of God. And the fact the laity were called to find holiness in their daily tasks, makes it all the more ironic, incomprehensible, and just flat out ridiculous. The spirit of Vatican II calls the laity to become little priests. Not only shouldn't they be doing that, the separation and distinctiveness of the priesthood needs to be retained, but they are actually damaging their own opportunities for holiness by neglecting the daily tasks they can use to grow spiritually. The laity and priesthood have different roles to play, different postings in the great spiritual battle. Although the priesthood of the laity is a very real thing, it is radically different from the sacramental priesthood of the, priesthood. The clergy have a power no layman will ever have. They have the highest power a human can have, which is to celebrate the sacraments and bring the means of salvation to humanity. And so, silence allows us more than merely a quiet moment to reflect. Silence draws a line between the laity and the priesthood, preserving the distinctiveness which is essential for authentic reception of the sacraments, most especially the Eucharist. The Mass is a holy and solemn event, sacred and separate. Silence in the liturgy is conducive to that. We, as the laity, should remain silent when called to it, both for ourselves and those around us. And priests should retain the silence they are called to, so as to better serve the role they were ordained for. Perhaps they can even begin to offer the Eucharistic prayers in the Novus Ordo silently, retaining this beautiful tradition from the old Mass into the new. Regardless of that, I think it's pretty clear, in many ways, silence is liturgically golden. And with that, I think we can call this case closed.